political commentator and investigative journalist. You're with Patrick Henningsen on today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We're now number 2 of this live broadcast, live and direct here on TNT. Today's going to be changing gears here. We're going to go back to international politics. I want to welcome onto the stage very special guest from the Russian Federation who's going to be joining us, Yulia Berg. She is a political scientist, also founder of the GLOBUS Expert Club. She's joining us right now on the live link. Yulia, thank you for joining us on TNT this week.
Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure.
No, it's our pleasure as well. And this is election season for the Russian Federation. There's a lot of important elections coming up. We're talking a lot, especially this week, about the new regions, as they're called in Russia, with the elections coming up there. I want to get your comments on that, just in general, the situation in the Donbass and in some of these parts of what these new parts of the Russian Federation. Obviously, this is I'll caveat this for some Western audiences. This will be a very controversial subject because many in the United States will regard these as Ukraine still, even after everything that's happened over the last 2 years. So that said, I want to just get your thoughts on the upcoming election. How significant is this for the Russian Federation? And also your experience past previously with election monitoring in this region as well. We spoke to Sonia van den Ende just before in the previous hour. She had a lot to share on this subject, but I'm sure you do as well. But go ahead, Yulia.
Well, you know, my first job and my first professional experience was related to the elections, and that was back in 2006. So I could talk about this probably forever. Let me just make several clear points, and then if there are additional questions, we could dive deeper into those. But what's important to understand is that in the Russian Federation, the electoral system as well as it is, has been evolving for around 30 years, and it has been evolving under a great pressure, both from the inside, which is the internal opposition, and various kinds of electoral monitoring organizations. And also from the, it was evolving because of the external pressure, because every time Russia would have elections organized, there would always be a lot of criticism, mostly coming from the West. So that's why the electoral system and all of the procedures in the country have reached a level at which there is not too many electoral systems that you can compare it with, because it's highly digitalized. They have been testing online voting and various kinds of equipment used for polling stations. The procedures have become so transparent. So, for instance, in Russian Federation, since, if I'm not mistaken, 2012, you have web cameras almost at each polling station. So you can just go to the website of the Electoral Commission and see what's happening at pretty much any polling station, which gives it incredible transparency, right? And a lot of NGOs monitoring the elections were using that in order to detect possible fraud or violations of the electoral law. But it's interesting to say that back in the 90s, the first 2 parliamentary campaigns taking place in the country were over-competitive, I would say, because there were hundreds of political parties. Those were mostly, well, all of them were brand new, as Russia had just switched to a different political regime at that point. Now you have a system that is quite stable, and you have less political parties, but still every electoral cycle would bring new either political parties or other entities or different candidates to the arena. But what's important in this particular election is that there are 4 new regions that joined the Russian Federation just recently. and it's about 10 million people joining in. So one of the biggest problems over there is the voters lists, right? Because those are areas where you still have ongoing battles. It's a war zone pretty much. So that's why it's really hard to trace people. And sometimes when you have regional administrations or other governmental institutions that are supposed to keep track of the citizens, you cannot even find documents that you need, because some of them just simply got destroyed or were intentionally burnt or whatsoever else as a result of the conflict ongoing in the area. So voters lists were quite a big problem during the preparation process. And another problem is that electoral committee members do not have the experience that we have here on the mainland, as we call it. And it means that in a very fast way, they had to adapt to the legislation, to the procedures that are quite sophisticated on this side, because as I mentioned at the very beginning, the system itself was evolving because of the pressure. So after each election, there would be quite a lot of, or there was quite a lot of criticism, which made the Central Electoral Commission change a lot of procedural procedures and rules, right, in order to make it more transparent, in order for electoral observers to be able to control the process and so on.
What's interesting, maybe you can comment on this, in this, you kind of alluded to this before, in the war zones and when you have hostilities, you have internally displaced persons. You also have a lot of potential absentee voters, i.e. people who have left their region to have their families stay safe or stay with other members of the family in other parts of the Russian Federation. So about organizing their ability to vote, are there programs, or do they have procedures for this? Because I assume this is a big issue, but your comments on that.
Absolutely. So the overall population of those 4 regions is about 10 million people. Of course, some of them are under 18. It means that they're not eligible as voters. Yet at the same time, the way they trace them at the moment is that the ones willing were given Russian passports. And so this is something that can easily be traced. Yet, just like you mentioned, there are internally displaced people. There are some people who are absent because after getting the passports, a lot of them moved to safer areas or just simply more comfortable ones. So it's not easy to trace them. And at the same time, you have quite a lot of people that are normally based in other regions of the Russian Federation, but do their service in those regions. So for them, the procedure is that beforehand, several days before the election, they need to come to the closest polling station where they intend to vote, and they need to register as voters. So they need to provide valid documents that show that they are normally based somewhere else, and registration in the Russian Federation is obligatory. So it's a stamp in your passport that you have that basically says where you live or where you mainly live. And depending on that, you choose your polling station. But some of the regions this year have joined a pilot program that implies that an app that provides state services or governmental services can be used to vote online. So there are options for those people that are citizens of the Russian Federation based in other regions and happen to find themselves in the new regions, for instance, during the election period.
And also, Sonia, I know that you've got a lot of experience in doing election observations and monitoring in other countries. I know you've also done this work in Africa as well, and you probably have a lot of, let's say, observations of being able to compare and contrast how things are done in different countries. What are some of the things that that you learned from those experiences, and how can you apply that to let's say evaluating the success or the the ability to provide access to voters in what you're calling the new regions in the Donbass and Crimea and so forth. What are some of your thoughts about that, having been around to different parts of the world, looking at these processes?
I've tried probably all of the possible roles during the election. So just like I mentioned, I started taking part in those back in 2006, so almost 20 years ago. And I was an electoral committee member. I was a candidate at municipal elections. I was representing the candidates' headquarters, and I was working with different political parties, and that's quite a lot of experience. So what's interesting is that one of the tendencies that can be observed is that at the moment you have smaller and smaller numbers of voters turnout, so people are less interested in the elections themselves, and they're less willing to participate and practice their rights. So that's quite a problem, because for instance, at the regional level of elections, you hardly ever see turnout that would be more than 40%. If you talk about central Russia, there are some regions where voters have maybe more discipline or responsibility, and the numbers would be much higher. But on the average, at the federal level of elections, that would be around 50, 60, a bit more than 60%. And what it means is that there can be more manipulations and fraudulent activities, because the less people you have at the polling station and the less ballots are used, the more space for manipulation you can potentially have. So some of the oppositional forces, in some cases, they call for boycott, which doesn't really make sense if you look at it as a political technologist, right? Or a person, or a consultant, a person who is, designing the rules of the game in order for them to be, more or less objective. So that's one of the problems: people not willing to practice their rights. Yet at the same time, the presidential election always scores top in terms of turnout. So that's the most interesting one for the voters. In most cases. And if you look at other countries, and I've been, all around Africa, in Zimbabwe, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, in South Africa, Madagascar, Mozambique, observing elections and interacting with electoral committees, and moreover, Kyrgyzstan as well, and Armenia during the referendum. So the rules are very different from country to country. But what is interesting regarding the African election is that instead of putting a tick on the ballot paper, in many cases they would use their thumb and put like a fingerprint. Of course, it's not that there is some expertise taking place to make sure that that's exactly the person who was given the ballot, but in any case, it also implies some transparency. So it's much more difficult to just put in some of the fraudulent ballots into the ballot boxes. Yet at the same time, elections are always full of different kinds of situations and scandals, and sometimes it's like a sitcom. And there is no way you can avoid it, because it's a moment of, high pressure and tension. And of course, sometimes you have different incidents happening, and, up to fights between supporters of different political parties and this kind of things. In Africa as well, sometimes it gets complicated when, for instance, electricity goes off and you need to finish counting with the candlelight or flashlight or this kind of things. And in DRC, for instance, on the election day when we observed the presidential election, there was almost like a flooding rain, at least in the capital city. And for that reason, before the rain was over, up until like lunchtime, people weren't really able to make it to the polling stations. And that's why towards the end of the day, you had crazy queues consisting of hundreds of people. And so the electoral committees had to make a decision not to close at 8 p.m. as they were supposed to, but they allowed everyone who came before 8 p.m. to vote, for instance. So also in some of the countries in Africa, aside for names of the political parties or candidates or brief descriptions, you can notice that the campaigning itself is different. So there are more portraits and more of images. And they also use that kind of ballot papers with big images instead of text in order to provide additional opportunities for people that are unable to read in, let's say, the official languages. Because in Africa, sometimes you happen to see situations when people from neighboring villages speak different languages, right? There are hundreds of languages in Africa. And in rural areas, not everyone speaks, let's say, English or French fluently, or is able to read in English and French. So they speak their native languages. So that's another issue. And for that reason, even the way the ballot papers look would be quite different. But if you compare some of the African procedures to the European ones, let's say, you would find them to be more transparent in many cases, because in Zimbabwe, for instance, after the counting is over, they put the papers with all of the final numbers on the door of the polling station. So in the morning, you can pass by and you can take a look at all of the numbers and then compare them with the official data. And that is clearly leaving much less space for various kinds of manipulations. And moreover, in those during those elections, when I was a part of observation missions, I happened to see that, especially not in the capital cities, but in suburban areas and rural areas, people are very open and friendly. And the members of the electoral committees are very open to observers. So they're willing to explain the processes, the procedures, and to guide observers through the processes. So that seemed, to be quite open. And I would say that you do not really see too many observers missions during African elections. So normally those would be some of the regional African organizations, and sometimes the European Union or other organizations would send observers and observation missions, but normally that would be not more than 50 to 100 people per country, which definitely cannot really cover all of the regions in an effective way.
I think a lot of people I can tell you a true story in the United States in the 2020 presidential election, key swing state in Georgia, a burst water pipe apparently flooded during the heat of counting between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. I think it was at 11 p.m. or something. They had to evacuate. The giant facility, and then they stopped counting for many, many hours. And all of a sudden at 3 a.m., they apparently began counting again, and as if by magic, Joe Biden shot ahead of Donald Trump. So I mean, if that happened in another country, they'd probably be screaming fraud, right? But in the United States, it's you couldn't even talk about it, or you'd get censored on social media at the time. I mean, that's a pretty extraordinary situation, and I'm saying this because the United States is very critical of everybody else's elections around the world. But I think we could probably do with international election monitors in the United States. Actually, is a record low confidence right now in elections, and one of the reasons as well is an over-reliance on electronic technology. And we got a couple minutes left. Do you have any thoughts on that? I mean, what have you observed on that issue of reliance on electronic voting, and how transparent are the systems? Are there better methods than other paper methods or hybrid methods? Your thoughts on that before we break.
Well, I think that it's even easier to manipulate digital systems, and there were quite a lot of investigations on the software being used in the United States, or that was used in the United States previously. It's just, very easy to program the software in a way in which you would get the result that you want, right? And there is no way you can double check it, because when you have papers, you have to archive them and you can recount at least that, right? So it makes it a bit more difficult. Yet at the same time, if that was based on blockchain technology that was open and transparent, at least for specialists to get in and see, it could have guaranteed better results. But in the United States, for instance, the electoral procedures and system is very closed. I mean, it's really hard to get there as an observer, and there are almost none. And foreign observation or international observation is pretty much non-existent in the United States. Whereas, for instance, in South Africa, if you are an NGO that has that point on your statute, now you can easily apply. You just send the lists, you send the documents related to your organization, and you get accreditation, and you can, go and see. So I would say that that's an indicator number one. If you have nothing to hide, why wouldn't you allow people just to, come and observe? What's the problem then? And in terms of digital technologies, now, of course, they simplify a lot, especially when you talk about voters lists and keeping track of the turnout. But when you talk about counting, I think that software is much easier to program.
Yeah, using big databases for voter rolls. That's one type. It's good that you separated those two things. And the other is the actual process of counting. That's where the real controversy takes place. Although there's accusations of manipulation of voter rolls. Certainly, we've seen that in the United States with the cross-check software where one party is striking people off the rolls, and another party might be using the same to double count as well. So yeah, I agree with you. With digital technology comes a lot more issues that sometimes aren't so transparent as one would like. But that's a big issue going forward. And I'm an advocate for old-fashioned paper ballots. There's a lot of countries that do it, and they manage to count it and announce the results on the same night. So it's not like it's impossible. Some countries actually still do that. But as we become more reliant on technology in the U.S., they're now taking 4 or 5 weeks to count, some states, like Arizona did in the midterm elections, which is really crazy. So yeah, I'm I guess a Luddite in that respect, very old-fashioned. I like paper ballots.
One of the key accusations, if I'm not mistaken, was that on those voter rolls, you could find dead people. And when you have paper lists, you can always see your neighbors and if they, signed or not on those lists, or your family members. And of course, it can pose questions if some of the ones that are gone are appearing on the list, right? And when you use digital systems, even for voters' rolls, there is less of opportunities to see at least that kind of fraud, the very obvious one when they just use data of people who are not even there anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and also big student populations around universities. Students register when the first time voting, usually 17, 18 years old, and they stay on the local rolls. And those rolls can be, those ballots could be harvested potentially. This also happens a lot. Certainly, I can talk about this in the United States. So, yeah, there's a lot of potential problems. But yeah, we're going to break now. But Yulia Berg, we really want to thank you for joining us on TNT this week and sharing your thoughts and your insights on this important issue.
Thank you.
There she goes, ladies and gentlemen. That is Yulia Berg from the GLOBUS Expert Club. She's a political scientist. Really appreciate her insights on this. We'll be talking more about this tomorrow as well. We're going to bring in some more people who are based in this region, in the Donbass, to discuss this. We'll get down to a lot more insights, a lot more detail, and also the political and geopolitical problems around the region and beyond. We'll be discussing those as well tomorrow. Let's take a break, however, and we'll connect with our research assistant for the show, Christian James, on the other side to look at the budget fiasco in the UK and much, much more coming up in just a few minutes. Stay right there.
It sounds pretty good. It sounds real, dude. Not bad, huh?
This is today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
I'm Patrick Henningsen, your host. Take care. I'll see you tomorrow, same time, same place.